Hello and welcome to another 3 Nerdcast. My name is Sir Biscuit. I write for 3 and I'm here with John Bunn, who writes for Way of the Eldar.
That's wayoftheeldar.blogspot.com, since I forgot to mention that in the last podcast.
Yeah, it's pretty good when it updates. So first in this podcast, before we get on to discussing 40K, I wanted to talk about Feast of Blades. For those of you that don't know, I'm the Invitational TO, John's the head judge, and our 40K events are basically sold out this year. There's no more room in the Invitational or the Open. There are some narrative spots left open, which is really cool this year. A big Blackstone fortress that you get to fight on. And John, do you want to tell them about the qualifier?
Oh yeah, we do have 2 spots open for the 40K Invitational that you can get by playing in the qualifier the night before. It's basically it's one more qualifier chance. It runs in the evening of Friday, and we kind of speed it up so that people have a chance to actually fall asleep before the Invitational. But that would be the one last opportunity you'll have to play in the Invitational. We do also have wait lists available, but obviously those aren't too reliable. So,
yeah. All right, on to actual 40K casting. So we wanted to talk a bit about Melee today. There's a lot of misconceptions about Melee this edition, I think. Melee was not something you would primarily build an army around last edition, and this edition it just seems to have gotten worse with the Overwatch appearing and the nerf to transports that you can't assault out of most of them anymore, even if they're stationary. So you see a lot of armies out there, especially on the internet, where people measure the strength of the army by its firepower. So you see a list, and then at the end of it, they'll summarize by saying, so I've got 15 las cannon shots and 10 missiles and whatever else, completely disregarding any melee capability. And that kind of makes sense, because you can't really visualize how a melee list works online, but it's really easy to look at 15 las cannon shots and think, oh, I could kill this with those, I could kill this. Like, that math is very simple to do.
yeah, I mean, shooting is 40K is obviously based in shooting. There's no doubts there. We're not going to go into it and say that melee is like the number one thing to focus on in 40K, because that's how they built the system. So it is a lot easier to, when you're theory hammering or something like that, count up how many wounds you can do to Marines and just go from there. And I think that's kind of, I don't necessarily think it's a bad way. I think it's almost a beginner way to look at list building and stuff like that. Obviously, you can still build very good shooting lists. Don't get me wrong there. You know, a better player will be better than a novice player with a shooting list. But I think that we're missing a lot of maybe elements that we can incorporate into the game that would maybe be able to push your list over the top.
Right, yeah. I mean, no one's going to come out and say that melee lists are the new black, because I don't think they've ever been. Though, I think melee always features prominently in a lot of winning lists. I think the important thing is to synergize melee elements with shooting elements. Kind of get a support thing going on.
Mm-hmm. I think it's easy for people to, like you said, count up the number of las cannons, but on turn 3 of the game, forget what units are actually capable of melee. When they're in the midst of a game, almost. And so, including those types of units in your list, even like we talked about in the last podcast, as basic as a tactical marine with a crack grenade, can still be considered somewhat powerful if the opponent just has armored 10 tanks or something,
Guardians.
Or Guardians.
Yeah, that's actually a strength of generalist lists, I think, is that they bring that melee element, and it gets ignored a lot, but I've won a lot of games because you can just go all in with Space Marines. You can have a turn where you're going, oh man, nothing's going my way, nothing's working, screw it, everyone charge. And you're not going to win all your combats, but if you win a few, sweep some units, blow up some tanks, suddenly you might be looking at a battlefield where you're much more even than you were a second ago.
I think it'll be good. This one will be a good build on the previous podcast, because we kind of mentioned how, how melee can turn the tide about, but we didn't really talk about how to get to melee, and I think that's what a lot of people are having issues with too. Is they just don't think melee is ever possible. So
That's true, and it's not helping when you see units like Assault Centurions, which really just don't. How did they get there?
Mutilator versus Assault Centurion. We will.
Oh boy, a Mutilator's even better though, because you can at least deep strike it in,
Yeah.
and it could just be a lone guy who's gonna go hunt random stuff, which I don't think is really a good buy, but it's an interesting choice and it might work in some lists. Assault Centurions, I don't ever see them working.
That's true. The unit size 3 is a killer, but
Yeah.
on top of everything else.
Well, up to 6, but the only transport you can put them in is a Land Raider. They can't deep strike.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not good enough in melee that they can take down a lot of Horde or Swarm units, because they're only 2 attacks, because they're 1 and then the extra close combat weapon. They could have at least put veterans inside those suits.
Yeah. Okay, so what kind of melee units do you want to talk about?
Well, I think melee units kind of broadly fall into 2 categories. Well, 3 categories once you start including monstrous creatures. But if you're just looking at like generic infantry, like if you were in the Marine decks, you would see fast melee units and you'd see durable melee units.
Okay.
And that's kind of the divide throughout most of the game, I think. And the general consensus people tend to hold is that durable melee units are really good and fast melee units are really bad. And, I mean, if you look at Marines, everyone likes Assault Terminators, right? Assault Terminators are really good.
Mm-hmm.
They're slow, but they're super durable. They're probably the most durable unit in the game, a 10-man unit of them, especially since the Paladin nerf in 6. But then you have Assault Marines as well, and everyone hates Assault Marines.
See, but I love Assault Marines, actually, but...
Yeah,
But-
well, we can talk about that in a sec.
Right. Yeah. But go ahead.
I think part of that it comes back to the math thing, where it's really easy to math out a las cannon shot. It's really easy to math out how much it takes to kill a Terminator.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really easy to look at an Assault Marine and say, well, it's just a Marine. I kill those all day.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hard to kill a Marine. That's just the truth of it. And the truth is you really can't calculate the value of a 12-inch move.
Yeah, I agree to that. I think, in my experience with Wraith Knights in particular, as much of an outlier as that is, a lot of people underestimate them solely on the fact that they can move 12 inches, and they don't really realize that on turn 2 of the game, I have a unit in their deployment zone that they didn't account for because they thought it only moved 6 inches, or they just didn't appreciate what 12 inches meant. Since there's not a lot of these units that you're actually seeing out there these days. You're seeing some cav units, some beast units, but these shooting lists don't have 12-inch moving units a lot of the time.
Right, and that's just something that the value of it changes as you go through the game, too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's very easy to look at a 12-inch move and say, all right, well, the difference between a 6-inch move and a 12-inch move is that I'm an assault on turn 2 instead of turn 3. I think that's a very kind of naive way to look at it, because that 12-inch move gets more and more valuable the further you get into the game. And actually, assault units get more and more valuable the further you get into the game, because there tends to be less and less guns, especially big guns, to shoot at them. The important thing is to stop looking at them that way, because you can take a unit of Assault Marines, and yeah, they can go assault on turn 2 and maybe die or something. But if you have a unit of Assault Marines, it's down to 3 or 4 guys, and it's turn 4, but you're in the enemy deployment zone, you can just pick your target. And there's going to be something those guys can take down, probably a lot of somethings, and probably something valuable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Indeed. And actually, to go along with that melee becoming more valuable later in the game thing, it can be worthwhile to do things like deep strike jetpacks, just because then they'll come in on turn 2 or 3, and they can avoid firepower. Because even if you're trading evenly with your opponent, you're losing stuff, right? You're both losing stuff. And so there's less to throw around the different aspects of your army. So I think melee units that come in late are very, very strong, especially since you might start the game with 4 las cannons, 5 las cannons, whatever. By the time turn 3 rolls around, you might have 1. So if you have something like a Mauler Fiend that's been sitting in reserve, and suddenly that pops out on the field, and you don't have your giant array of heavy weapons to deal with it, I think that's very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one thing that I usually have problems with is this balance between an assault unit and a shooting unit, and that's where maybe I have more trouble dealing with let's say, shooting Terminators, so just a standard Terminator with a Stormbolter and Power Fist, versus Assault Marines, because to me it seems like these Terminators are pressuring the entire time, while the Assault Marines are just moving up. Bolt pistols aren't worth really anything. And then they are a dedicated assault unit. So do you place much weight on these true dedicated assault units then, or do you like to have this duality, multiple use for your assault type units, I guess?
I think you have to be really careful with assault units, because Games Workshop tends to make a lot of shooting units that are bad, but the only reason they're bad is because they're not quite as cost effective as something else in the codex, right? But when you have an assault unit that's bad, it's just bad. Like, flayed ones are a great example of a unit that, if they had Fearless, they'd be great, because they could attrition stuff, but because they don't, they just lose. They tend to lose by pretty big margins to anything that's competent in assault, and then you just get swept, and you're done. So, it takes a lot of analysis to use units like that properly. And you're kind of getting back to the speed versus durability thing, where I think you need to look at what your list needs. And I think a lot of Marine lists do benefit a lot from Terminators. And even if they're not shooting Terminators, if they're just assault Terminators, you can still be pressuring the opponent without attacking them, even. Because wherever assault Terminators are standing, that's like a big 12-inch circle emanating out from them that nothing can go into, because they'll just destroy it. Just completely smash it apart, even if they're down to 3 guys that can win almost any combat in the game. So that's very useful. Assault Marines are filling a very different role. And I don't know if I like Assault Marines too much in the new decks, mostly because it seems like you could be taking a Bikes in a lot of the situations where you have them, and I think Bikes have a little more utility. But if you are taking Assault Marines, it's because you need something that moves up and can jump over enemy lines and can go harass things in the backfield. A great example of a unit like this actually is the Solitaire, which, for people who don't know, is a fan name for the Autarch on a jet bike with the Mantle of the Laughing God, which gives them hit and run and a 2+ rerollable cover save all the time. And just a laser lance. And maybe a fusion gun. Some people like to put the Fire Saber on him. I think he's getting a bit too expensive at that point. But he is very, very strong and very difficult to deal with for a lot of lists. Because if you can't ignore cover, then there's no way you're shooting him to death with a 2+ rerollable save. And most units, even if they charge him, like your basic TAC Marine squad, can't quite get the job done and kill him. So he can just jump around the backfield and hit 5-man Marine squads, hit Devastator squads. And even if he's just killing the Sergeant, like if you're a Marine Devastator squad, he charges you, your Sergeant challenges because you don't want to take a bunch of wounds. You're now taking a Leadership 7 test, and you're right near the edge of the table. You might just run right off. So I've lost games due to my inability to deal with that one fast guy. And at the end of the day, he's not that tough, because he's T4 with 3 wounds and a 3-up save. He shouldn't be that hard to kill. But if you're not prepared to deal with stuff like that, then he's just going to run all over your army, and there's nothing you can do. And at the end of the game, he's going to pick an objective and contest it, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So people also, I feel like I'm jumping around a little bit, but people also always bring up this topic, like even you talked about with flayed ones, where against a dedicated close combat unit, such and such like it has to be worthwhile against them. Do you really expect to see dedicated close combat units anymore? Because I don't feel like that's something that shows up as much. Like to me, to me as an Eldar player at least, a TAC Marine squad is a dedicated close combat unit for all intents and purposes. Well, it is a close combat unit, not dedicated, but is it maybe necessary for you to be able to take out assault Terminators with every squad that can go to close combat? For example, with Howling Banshees, I would not. Of course, a 5-man unit of Howling Banshees cannot take on Terminators, but I don't necessarily think they're terrible against Marines or something like that, or to be in a spot to just fill a counterattack role. Anyways, back to the. Do you think that there's a lot of these dedicated assault units out there now?
I probably shouldn't have said dedicated assault unit when I was talking about that. That is...
Well, no, but I hear it a lot. It's
yeah,
it's not just
that's
you.
the prevailing wisdom, yeah. Why would I take this when I'm just going to run into assault terminators and they're going to annihilate me, kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, people brought up a lot of the, at the start of 6th edition, how AP2 is so hard to come by in close combat, so you always need to take power axes, or else you're just a worthless unit.
Yeah, which is clearly not true if you're playing the real game. I think the problem with units like Flayed Ones, and this is a problem with unit like Orc Boys and the bog standard Chaos Marines too, is that you're pretty strong when you're full strength. Like a 20-man Flayed One unit that's charging in at something is going to mess up pretty much anything.
Yeah, what is that, 40 or 80 attacks or something like that?
They're 4 each on the charge.
Yeah.
So, 80 attacks. Even though they're weapon skill 4, strength 4. If you have a Xandric, you can give them Furious Charge and make them strength 5. I thought about this list a long time. So I figured out there's no stubborn or fearless that you can attach to Necron squads.
Yeah.
The problem is, what happens when you're not at 20 men? What happens when that squad's down to 8 guys? Suddenly you're not nearly as threatening. If something charges you, they have pretty good odds of wiping you out because you're just T4 with a 4 up. Or even worse, if you're Orcs or something, you're T4 with a 6 up.
Sure.
They're just going to mess you up. Or what if a bunch of things hit you at once? Like, you take your big Flayed One unit, and you put it in front of a Space Wolves army. All they need are 2 Grey Hunter squads to charge you. And they're going to win combat. If they win by, 4, you're likely to fail your morale test. You have terrible initiatives, so you're just going to get swept.
Sure. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I'm wondering if it's worth spending... I'm wondering if it's worth an army spending, 10% of their points or less on these types of units where, we'll use Striking Scorpions as an example.
Okay.
Scorpions themselves I wouldn't consider to be, like, the number 1 unit Eldar players go to. I don't think anyone would. They do fill kind of some certain roles, but they're definitely a close combat unit. They're not going to take out other close combat units because they're toughness 3. Even with a 3+ save. But, if I'm playing against other Eldar, if I'm playing against Tau, if I'm playing against a lot of these armies, they do have value, right? Like, if they do make it in and kill 2 models, the opponent's taking a leadership test on 8, 7, 6, whatever it may be, and they're probably going to sweep them. So, I'm wondering if it is going to be worthwhile to start including these so-called mediocre units, especially a 5th edition version of a mediocre close combat unit, into a list, since they don't necessarily need to take out a lot of, heck, in a 7-game tournament, I'm going to face one of these close combat type armies once, twice, maybe.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
It will happen.
The rise of MCs, yeah.
Yeah, it will happen, but is it, against a lot of other armies, though, I've got a unit that can do 3 wounds and sweep pretty regularly. So
yeah, I don't think it's bad. Striking Scorpions actually like a lot.
The initiative power fist is not terrible.
No, the fact that if you take that, you're guaranteed to win almost every challenge in the game.
That's true too.
Unless you're against some huge combat HQ, is really strong. Since they can't just lock you down in assault and be like, oh, you're stuck in a challenge forever, or whatever they want to do. And Striking Scorpions themselves aren't bad. They put out enough attacks that they're threatening to everything, including Marines, even a lot of the assault-oriented Marines. I think their problem is they don't really have a way to get there, and so they fall in that valley between a fast assault unit and a durable assault unit.
Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit then, like, getting there.
Right. Like, Banshees, I think, are the ultimate example of a unit that, even though they have the plus 3 inches on the run move, they're just not getting there. And they're really not durable at T3 with a 4 up.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Like, it seems like there's this point now where if I can have 2 models survive from these types of units, I'm winning combats. Whereas before, that was never the case. If I'm playing, and this also has to do a little bit with the limited number of Marines you saw recently. I mean, that's going to increase with the new codex coming out. But, if I had 2 Howling Banshees charge some Necron Warriors that weren't bunched up because they're looking out for blast templates, things like that, obviously they could die on Overwatch, but...
I mean, they could just get smashed to death by Necrons.
They could, but they could also. I mean, they have a better chance of killing 3 Necron warriors than you killing the 2 Banshees if they're spread out and things like that.
I guess I play with 20-man Necron warrior squads.
Well,
kind of
I guess it's kind of a weird.
So yeah, but you're talking about like a small squad.
Yeah, you know, like, 10-man squads. I feel like
actually a great target for them would be the 6-man squads that drop out of Night's Ice, where you have 5 guys and then the Cryptek, the full tech staff.
The Night's Ice squads, heck, Crude squads. You see a lot of Crude squads out there these days that 3 striking scorpions would decimate. You know,
right? Because you only need one of your guys to survive.
Yeah,
you're gonna get enough kills that you're still gonna win combat.
Yeah, I mean, are these types of units are more, now that we're talking about it, seem to be more and more appealing to me, where it's a unit. Okay, so a shooting unit. If I shoot at some Guardians, 10 Guardians are looking at me, I shoot them and I kill 8 guys.
Right.
The next units in my army, unless it's, you know, unless there's claiming an objective, unless they're doing something very important at that moment, the next units in my army are not shooting at that Guardian unit.
Right.
If I knock a 10-man unit of Scorpions down to 2 guys, you better believe that the next units in my army are still shooting at the Scorpions because they are much more important to me. You know, we talked about how if you have 3 Marines left alive at the end of a shooting phase, like they're still pretty, you know, they're decent.
Right.
They're good. They're still doing things. And I'm wondering if that starts to hold true for these types of assault units in, you know, in kind of the current meta, something like that.
Yeah, let me share a story with you.
Okay.
So last edition, I talked about my Thunder Bubble army in the last podcast, which is basically a lot of Marine shooting, backing just 10 Terminators. And I always put them with a Librarian with Gate of Infinity, so they could teleport across the board. Back when you could pick Gate of Infinity as a sure power in the old decks. And that was a great squad, those 10 Terminators. Because even if I was fighting a very shooty army, where I didn't need my Terminators to stand in front of me and block assault units, they provided so much value. And a lot of the time, I would hold them in reserve, and I'd deep strike them. And I'd put them down just near the enemy, and like they're not going to assault the turn they deep strike, obviously, because they can't. They might not even assault the next turn, but 10 Terminators are durable enough that it takes usually about an entire army's firepower to eliminate that one squad. Unless, you know, I get unlucky with armor saves or something. And that allows everyone else in the army to move up. And so I had a lot of games where I dropped these Terminators and like on the drop people would kill 6 of them or 8 of them. And then next turn they'd finish them off. But, you know, they shot their entire army at them and then they shot half their army at them. And suddenly I have 40 tactical Marines who are just standing in front of a bunch of Guardians or Fire Warriors or Guardsmen. And just punch them to death and then steamroll them after that.
That seems like a good thing, yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's really where those durable assault units come in handy. Yeah. Is because even if they never get an assault off, if your enemy had to focus on them that much, that you can just position the rest of your army in the counter positions. So your units that are better at assaulting the enemy are in assault range, you know, your anti-tank units are set up to shoot at tanks, all that. You just won the game.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Marine hate, or sorry, not the Marine hate, the assault hate came from Marine versus Marine combat. Because this was like, since 3rd edition, this was the biggest joke ever, where you'd have 2 Marine squads get into combat with each other, and it became the game of, I roll 10 dice, half of those hit, half of those wound, and they all save. Or, you know, one person fails a wound, and you're like, yay, I killed a Marine, and then for 4 more turns, these Marines are sitting together, doing nothing. And that's just really not the case anymore. I mean, Marines just aren't the norm. And when Marines aren't the norm, like, these combats are way more, they change the course of the game a lot more. And of course, that all depends on what types of units you take and things like that. So, anyways, we can move on to, how do you think...
One more thing in this category before we move on. I was just actually thinking, my buddy who plays Chaos, he always rolls on telepathy, and he actually rolls 2 sorcerers who all roll on telepathy. Because that's a lot of fun psychic powers. And a power he always loves to get is the fearless one. Remember what it's called? Embolden?
Yeah,
maybe?
Sure.
Or
Embolden Horrify is the Eldar one.
That's the Eldar one. Whatever. It makes a unit fearless within, I think, 12 or 24 inches. And he loves to roll that power because he has a couple 10-man cultist squads. And if you can make a 10-man cultist squad fearless, a lot of the times you can kind of use them more near the front. Mm-hmm. So he'll have a 10-man cultist squad will be near the front. He'll make them fearless because then even if assault marines assault them, they might kill 6 guys. There's 4 left. Then he counter assaults with his chaos marines. They finish him off. He still has like a 4-man scoring unit.
You know,
okay.
Just a quick note on that. Mm-hmm. When people think of assault units, I've had a number of people charge my jet bikes. Like, I wasn't thinking about it at the time or something like that, but a couple times it's happened to me where cultists come out and they charge my jet bikes. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is just the silliest thing ever because, I mean, you know, these are cultists. And, of course, they kill a jet bike. Mm-hmm. And or maybe even 2. But at the end of the day, it's like, wait a second. The way assault works now, like, you know, I'm still taking break tests on, like, Leadership 6 or Leadership 7. And I have these cultists that are just shooing off my jet bikes. But they're not assault units. But in this case, they are definitely considered assault units. And, you know, creates space for little 3-man jet bike squads that they have to worry about. So.
Right. If you're thinking you need something like a Power Fist and Terminator armor to be an assault unit,
yeah, and
then
I think you
need to do more math, I think.
Yeah, I think
that's most of what it is being able to run that comparison between units.
Yeah, I think I really feel like, you know, from 3rd to 5th, it felt like you had to have a Power Fist veteran sergeant to be worthwhile in close combat, and that's just not the case anymore. Mm. So, you know, a lot of this talk that we have about assault units doesn't really necessarily mean a unit that has 2 close combat weapons, has, you know, a couple special assault weapons, things like that. I mean, it's as simple as it could be cultists versus guardians, or attack marines versus anything that's not a marine.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, moving on, we wanted to talk about monstrous creatures and the rise of monstrous creatures in the meta.
Oh man.
Because if you've been paying attention, they are fairly popular at the moment.
This totally goes along with my theory that Games Workshop is using fantasy as like the footprint for 40K. Because between, you know, the main focus on this is fantasy received all these large monsters, and they were like the coolest models, but man, the rules just did not fit large monsters. Like, they get blown apart by cannonballs, they get bogged down by units, things like that. But sure enough, 6th edition comes out, and 40K has monstrous creatures out the wazoo, and boy do they have some powerful ones, because they are very tough. Yeah. For the most part. The ones that you see. They fix that problem right away. So go ahead. Monstrous creatures.
This is maybe not the right place to start this conversation, but I was talking to my buddy the other day about dreadnoughts, actually. Mm-hmm. And I was going, man, why can't the dreadnought be a monstrous creature? Because right now being a vehicle sucks for a dreadnought.
Being a walker is terrible.
Because they're supposed to be assault guys, but almost any damage result completely screws you. Because if you get stunned, you can't afford to stand there for a turn. If you get weapon destroyed, you lose your assault arm. If you're immobilized, you can't go assault anyone anymore. And obviously, if you're destroyed...
Explodes is okay, I think. No, not at all.
Explodes you can deal with.
Yeah.
And so everybody was like, oh, so you just want him to be a 3-wound T8 monstrous creature. And I was like, well, I don't know if they'd be T8 or not. And he was like, well, T8's AV12. I was like, what? And I was like, oh, yeah, because everything you need to glance or pen AB12 is the same roll to wound
basically.
T8.
Yeah. That's So I'll tell you a story, young whippersnapper, but once upon a time when Wraith Knights originally came out, Wraith Lords, apologies.
You mean Eldar Dreadnoughts?
Yes.
I'm not completely ignorant.
when Eldar Dreadnoughts existed and then became Wraith Lords, everyone made these comparisons between Toughness 8 versus Armor 12 and so on. So... anyways.
Right, but my point is, there's not even a vehicle in the game that is AB12 and has 6 hull points.
That's true.
Wraith Knight is.
That's a thing. Yeah. Yeah, they feel like they went a little overboard with that, but yeah, monstrous creatures, they're out there now. They're not the easiest things to deal with, even with a bunch of theory hammer behind it, because you just play those games where they make 3 cover saves, and at the end of the day, there's not every weapon in your army can hurt these things sometimes.
Right, you know? And those weapons that can hurt them are usually the first that disappear.
Yeah, they're the first that disappear. They're the first ones that shoot. And I've been there. I've been in those turns where you start out and you're like, great, I've got 3 broadsides with Monster Hunter pointing at this Wraith Knight. Let's roll the dice. It should kill it. All of a sudden, there's a Wraith Knight with 3 wounds left sitting in front of me. Well, crap. Like, your level of anxiety kicks up so much when you've shot the weapons that should have killed him, and, like, they don't. And then your mind just goes into this spiral of, how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to deal with this? Mm-hmm. So I definitely think that there's something that you need to plan around. And, a lot of that can be with deployment, with spreading out stuff. You can't just turtle up now, because if you have 3 Wraith Knights charge you and all of a sudden you didn't kill one on the first turn, we have some issues. Like, our entire army is about to be rocked. Mm-hmm. So, we can spread out a little bit. Spread out the elements that can hurt these Wraith Knights.
It's hard even then, though,
or MCs.
As you were saying, Wraith Knights are so mobile. And if you're playing a competent player, you can't, like, the common advice for a lot of hammer units is, ignore them. You can't really ignore a Wraith Knight, because if your opponent's competent, they're going to see exactly where the linchpin of your plan is, and the Wraith Knight's going to go stand there.
Yeah. And the Wraith Knight's going to move 12. He might even run just to spite you.
Right.
Because of your grand plan that didn't work out. Riptides are the same way. They're looking at a 6-inch move followed by maybe a 4d6-inch follow-up in the assault phase, if they understand what's going on.
Not to mention that a Riptide can still win assault against a lot of things.
They can indeed, against, a lot of the units I have. Flying monstrous creatures, the obvious ones here again. They sacrifice... Before it didn't seem like it, but now it's apparent that flying monster creatures sacrifice a little bit of defense for the abilities that they have as an FMC. Tyranids will be obviously the confusing one. We'll have to see what they introduce there. But monstrous creatures are here to stay. They're going to stay, and we're about to receive the next codex of the monstrous creature.
The granddaddy of all monstrous creature builds.
So how do we deal with them? What are we going to do?
Grab bikes.
Grab bikes all the time.
Grab Centurions.
Tyranids take grab bikes. Yeah, grab Centurions.
I think the answer kind of comes back to this idea of having those medium tier assault units, or having really good assault units.
Yeah.
That can kind of hang out in your army. This is something that kind of blew my mind, as you see this the demon flying list, where it's a whole bunch of demon princes, and a great unclean one, and Fate Weaver, and they have the grimoire, and they just come at you. It's a bunch of flying monster creatures. And I was a little confused when that came out and started doing amazingly well. I guess I wasn't really, because I've seen tournament lists and I know what it was fighting.
Yeah.
Because a demon prince just isn't hard to kill.
No.
They're T5, they have 4 wounds?
Yeah, 4 wounds.
3 up save if you bought them one. 3 5 up.
They might have some defensive abilities, but not everyone does, so, you'll obviously find some that don't have reroll invulnerable saves or things like that. But
right, and I mean, even though they have the grimoire, obviously that makes a demon in the army super tough, but then you can shoot the others.
Yeah.
And I'm just remembering back in 5th edition when my buddy used to run dual demon princes, and they'd always drop down in front of me and be really menacing, and then die to bolt guns, because I'm still wounding them on 5s, and you only have 4 wounds.
Poor Tyranid, Devourer, Hive Tyrants, things like that, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And now Sternguard are really good. So you can just drop a squad of Sternguard in the backfield and, Hellfire Shell, a great unclean one, off the board.
Yeah, that's true. 2+ poison never hurts. I hesitate when people... I'll post lists from time to time, and people will suggest, just take a lot of poison stuff. But poison's, poison or sniper in general, it's just not always useful. We're talking about how there's always these monstrous creatures about, but the units that tend to have poison, and this comes back again to, we're going to shoot the things that threaten us. They're generally very easy to kill.
Right. Sternguard are not hard to wipe out.
For 22 points a model, correct? They're Marines.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think that that's always the option. Of course, Sternguard are good in lots of situations outside of Marines, but saying, or outside of monster creatures, but saying things like, I'm going to take Dark Eldar to spite you and spam a bunch of,
poison.
Some poison, whatever they're called.
Yeah, Venoms.
The cannons, the splinter cannons, things like that. That's... I wouldn't offer that up as my first piece of advice on how to deal with a monstrous creature.
No, I guess that's a little bit of a nuanced counter too. Here's the important thing to realize about Stern Guard is that they're probably not going to kill whatever you drop them next to. They'll just hurt it.
Yeah.
So, like, if you drop a unit of 10 Stern Guard next to a Wraith Knight, and you rapid fire it, and you don't support it with anything, just be prepared to lose all of them before they do anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, that does happen. Honestly, my piece of advice is to take things that have instant death. And they're hard to find.
They're really good.
But they're really good. Even things as simple... I've had my Wraith Knight killed by Force Staves. And as embarrassing as it is to admit, it does happen. I might have purposely been putting my Wraith Knight in base-to-base contact with this Force Stave, but they're things that help. A Black Mace Demon Prince is an excellent counter to these other Wraith.
And once you realize it has Flesh Bane?
Yes. Once you know the rules for a Black Mace. If you can find things in your list that instant kill things, I think they're very worthwhile, especially if they have somewhat of a range to them.
Right. That makes sense.
More worthwhile than they used to be. Instant death used to kind of be a silly rule to have because everything that you fought against either had Eternal Warrior, like the characters that you cared about.
Right, or you could barely hurt it.
Yeah, so like Lysander, who cared? Because everything that had instant death just bounced off Lysander anyways, so why take it? Yeah, I do think force weapons are important to have these days.
They're good, but if you don't have something like that, then you are relying on your Stern Guard drops or whatever. I think the important thing is just keep them supported. Your plan should never be this one unit is going to drop in a drop pod while the rest of my army maybe walks up 6 inches. Because it doesn't matter what you're dropping, the unit's going to die.
Yeah.
If you can drop a unit and you're moving up Assault Marines and you're moving up in flat out and Rhinos, things like that, then it works a lot better. And if you can't support that unit in the drop pod, it's probably time to look at maybe cutting it out of your list and adding something else so you can have a coherent advance.
Yeah, I would always dedicate at least 2 turns to killing one of these powerful monstrous creatures. It's a huge investment, but I've seen plenty of people that get ready to go, they set up all their shooting for a turn, they do some wounds, and then it's like, that's it. All of a sudden, the plan didn't work, so I'm going to switch to plan B. But really, if you're going to take these things down, you need to set up for turn 1 and turn 2 of shooting at it, not just expecting it to die and then you move on. A Riptide passes, I use the example again, but a Riptide passes 3 saves, or let's say you didn't ground the monstrous creature, the flying monstrous creature.
Right.
People do that, and it was all dice. It's like, well, the dice were terrible in your situation, but if you set up in a way such that the following turn you're putting out an equal amount of firepower, or at least a decent amount of firepower, it really helps. So.
Right. Yeah.
It's not the easiest thing to plan for, but it's something to think about.
I remember when we were playing, we played in a feast qualifier. Obviously, we couldn't win because we're in staff. We were just there to have fun at the local store. We knew a bunch of the guys who were participating in it. And I had to pull John aside at one point and ask him, what are the rules for jumping off a building? Because I had a Wraith Knight right in my face, and I had Xandric, who has a 2-up, 3-up save. He's not Eternal Warrior or anything, but he was standing on top of a building with these Necrons on this objective, and there was a Wraith Knight right next to me. I'm thinking, it's going to assault me and sweep me next turn. Unless Xandric jumps off the building and goes and fights him and passes a bunch of invulnerable saves. And so you got to think about that kind of stuff, where that's clearly kind of an absurd tactic on the face of it, because I want my commander to leap off the 3rd story of a building and go charge a creature that can squash him in a single hit. And it almost worked, actually. I needed him to survive for 2 turns. He made it the first one, and then he failed 1 save on the second one, which was a bummer.
A lot of these...
But at least I was prepared,
Yeah,
I didn't give up.
It's also almost easy to identify sometimes what these monster creatures are made for. When you look at a stock, when you look at a Riptide, it is clearly made for shooting. and it almost always does more damage in the shooting phase than it does in the assault phase. So if you can get a unit up close to it, even though it's hard to kill, especially with Marines or something like that, you may as well tie it up for a little bit and reduce the damage output. And I wouldn't say that about a lot of units anymore in 40k, but monstrous creatures cost so much that keeping them from doing their primary objective, like their primary purpose, is a worthwhile investment, even if it doesn't kill them sometimes.
Yeah.
Whereas 10 Marines, it's hard to identify maybe what the opponent thinks they're going to be using for outside of claiming an objective, something like that. Most stuff doesn't cost 300 points like a fully kitted out Wraith Knight.
Yeah.
So,
and actually, yeah, the Wraith Knight's hell would be fighting my buddy who has the Cultist and the Fearless spell.
Yeah.
And suddenly your Wraith Knight's just stopping on 2 Cultists a turn for the next rest of the game.
people will offer up a suggestion of, well, I'll just lock it up in close combat, but then when the game hits, they don't do it. And you really need to stay focused on that goal of what makes this monstrous creature not do its job. If there's a black mace monstrous creature across from me, not doing its job is getting into close combat. So,
yeah, and against a lot of these lists, you have to have a different mentality, because it's really easy to go into games and it's like, I have my list. My list has a plan. I'm going to execute it, and either I'm going to stomp this guy, or this game's unfair and I lose.
It is unfair. Everything's always
you
unfair.
see that all the time, but to be a good player, you kind of have to learn to lose into a win, basically. You have to be able to identify, well, this only has so many actions left, and I can sacrifice maybe half my army to slow it down, and I'll lose them all. But if I do that, I win.
Yeah, I think, this all ties into having that balanced list where some of you can see a unit of tactical Marines as both an assault option and a shooting option, not just your stand there and blow something away, because when they're plinking bolter shells off of Riptide's armor, they're definitely not worth anything compared to when they're punching it in the face and not doing anything, but at least keeping it from shooting.
Right, at least it's not marker lighting up and being BS5 ignores cover, death large blast. Yeah. It's just kicking a Marine or 2 to death a turn.
Yes.
I'm very okay with that.
Do you have anything else on that? Because I think it's a good segue into the last subject. At least one of the uses for these units.
Yes, I think so. Why don't you get us started?
So, the final topic we're going to cover today is about dedicated transports. And you might be thinking right now, what in the world does he mean by this is a good segue? Because monstrous creatures and dedicated transports don't mix at all.
Well, Tyranids have one. You can put a monstrous creature in my Set Explorer.
Yes, there you go. You've ruined my whole argument. So, dedicated transports have way more uses than people realize. And that's come in part due to Games Workshop reducing the points cost on a lot of these dedicated transports. A 50-point Rhino does not have these uses like a 35-point Rhino does. So we might go over a couple things, that maybe you don't normally think about when using dedicated transports, why they're good, why they're not good,
Right.
Why First Blood was the nail in the coffin in the first place for these things, because it was.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, and their role changed so much from 5th to 6th.
Yes.
To understand why dedicated transports just kind of hit a wall and disappeared, you have to understand what they were used for in 5th edition. Which 5th edition was about tanks. It really was, because tanks could move fast and only be hit on 6s. They were very damage resilient because they didn't have hull points. So
They assisted with the demise of close combat.
Yeah, they very much assist with the demise of close combat, because if a bunch of rhinos roll up to you, as long as they're moving at a decent clip, you're just never going to destroy them, because you only hit them on 6s. And so, because it was so tank-oriented, you would have... The purpose of a rhino was to drive around and shoot a melt-a-gun out the top, because who cares about the other guns we're shooting at tanks? And the rhino itself was durable, and so you had sort of this tank warfare thing, and I don't want to say that was all the game was about, because that would be complete lie, but it was a pretty major part of 5th edition. Then 6th hit, and suddenly transports were easy to destroy. You couldn't even assault out of them anymore. You couldn't 5th if they stood still. And you didn't need to hunt tanks anymore, because as transports were disappearing, tanks were disappearing, because they weren't nearly as durable as they were before.
Yeah, people saw that they weren't a pillbox, and since they weren't a pillbox for an assault unit, or for an assault unit, they kind of lost a lot of appeal. But vehicles did gain some abilities in this set, not even based on really the vehicle rules. Line of sight is huge in this edition, and true line of sight being introduced,
And
whether it's good or not.
Also being unable to remove casualties that you can't see, which wasn't in last edition.
Exactly. So, between lookout sirs or targeting certain independent characters, things like that. So, anyways, vehicles are one of the more solid units you can move on the table as far as blocking line of sight, things like that. They're almost like a wall in most cases, and they also have increased mobility because of moving flat out.
Everything can move flat out 6 inches further than it could last edition. So, the moral of the story ends up being that transports don't exist to put your units in someone's face. You can go assault them out of them, or shoot your melta gun out of the top. They exist more, and you were saying this before the cast, to ferry units to positions.
Right.
So, put shooting units where they need to be.
Right. Once upon a time, I wrote this semi-terrible blog post, but it was about, right as 6th edition started, I saw a lot of lists complaining, or a lot of people complaining about how dedicated transports were worthless, how my Blood Angels Assault Squad, when it's in a Rhino, it has to get out, has to move up, get out, whatever. And even to this day, I see people that will have a 10-man unit of Marines in a transport, in a Rhino. They'll move up. They might move up 6 inches so they can shoot a little bit. They might move up 12 inches and then pop smoke. But rarely do I see them move up 12 inches and then flat out. Or rarely do I see the Rhino used once the unit's out of it. And, that's like the first step with the Rhino or with these small dedicated transports is definitely getting ferrying units to positions with their speed. If I move it 12 inches, I don't really gain anything outside of moving it 6 inches and then deploying and moving the unit. But if I move it 12 inches and then flat out, I've gained some tempo, almost.
Right.
And then beyond that, using these tanks to block line of sight in the shooting phase, using them to tank shock, which is almost a dead rule. I rarely see it used, but man, tank shock is really good when it works.
Yeah.
And I have slowly learned this. If you fail a leadership test in the movement phase, and then you take 25% casualties in the shooting phase, it was the same as last edition. But, if I tank shock a unit of Marines and they fail a leadership test, they're like, well, I'm going to rally next turn. In the following shooting phase, if I shoot them and they lose 25% of the models, they're going to fall back again.
Yeah, they auto-fail the morale test.
They auto-fail again.
And they have to fall back again, so they falling back 46 at this point.
Yeah. And, little things like that make these 35-point pillboxes that aren't really pillboxes anymore kind of useful. Do you have a...
Yeah. The first thing, people throw around a lot that if a dedicated transport gets shaken or stunned, that result passes on to the passengers, even if you get out. And I hear that used a lot as an argument against them. My observation has been that rarely actually happens. Vehicles tend to be destroyed either because they got hit by a very high AP weapon, so they exploded, and there really wasn't much of a chance of them getting stunned or shaken, or it's a bunch of strike 7, so they just lost all their hull points. I've played many games with my Rhinos. The times I've been stunned and unable to shoot, I think it's happened twice, maybe 50, 60 games I play with that list.
I do think it's funny how many times people will tell me, well, the vehicle just gets glanced to death. And I'm like, okay, so the unit gets out and shoots. And I'm like, no, but actually the unit was stunned because it was shot at, because the tank was stunned. It's like, okay, how many scenarios am I going to plan for, or do I just assume happen to make this so bad that it's just unbearable to take? And
yeah, here's the thing to understand too. We're talking about dedicated transports as ferrying a unit to a position, not as a mobile bunker. And so, even if the vehicle does get shot to death, if I got an 18-inch move before that happened, my guys are probably going to be pretty happy where they're at. The Rhino was probably sitting where they wanted to get out.
And you know what? A lot of times in these situations, if you did make an 18-inch move, that Rhino has to be destroyed. And that is an easy task, don't get me wrong. It's not like
Right,
I'm saying this is hard.
It has to be destroyed.
But it does have to
such
be
a good position.
destroyed. Yeah. It's the same thing with these assault units where if I put 10 in front of you, you kill 8. That doesn't really do you any good. But if you have to kill that last couple of models.
Right. Yeah, and I've been playing a bit with White Scars, but not all bikes because all bike lists are expensive. And I've put a couple tac squads in there with Rhino because if you have Con, it's a dedicated transport, so they get to scout. And I really, really like a couple of tac squads in that list because I get my 12-inch scout move, and then next turn I get up to 18 inches. Those tac squads can be anywhere on the board.
Mm-hmm.
They can be at the turn 2.
Yeah.
No, turn 3. No, yeah, turn 2. They can be anywhere they want. Yeah, even in your deployment zone. I've had games where I've scouted my Rhino. I've moved flat out turn 1, and turn 2 I get out in an ironbark forest in my edge of my opponent's deployment zone, and they just sit there the rest of the game.
Oh man,
be a huge pain in the ass.
Some good Marines. See, my Raven Guard would be a 2+ cover save.
Oh,
in those.
I
did do a recent blog post about adding these type of scout Marines with dedicated transports in there. And as a side note, just so everyone's aware, if a unit has scout or infiltrate and it is a dedicated transport, they then get to scout or infiltrate with that dedicated transport. So
right, that's in the rules.
Yeah. Once upon a time, I thought about having 30 striking scorpions in wave serpents, just so that I could infiltrate all these wave serpents and do silliness there. But those are just musings.
30 striking scorpions is expensive and nothing to build a list around.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think if you adjust your view on dedicated transports, then I think they tend to become a lot better.
Yeah, I mean even Devilfish. Devilfish are expensive. They're not anywhere near the cheap Rhino, but they do help your fire warriors get to places that they can't get to without help. And they even sit there with a 4+ cover save when they do so. And Tau have problems with getting to objectives. Eldar, if you don't have jet bikes, which you probably do, but they do have problems getting to objectives if you can't you need that little boost of movement to start the game, not to mention a little protection from time to time. The First Blood argument.
Oh.
There is not a unit in this game that if the opponent wants First Blood, they won't give them First Blood.
Right.
You're not going to
build
fill
a
your
list.
Yeah, unless you're going to do 10 Grey Knight Paladins with Drago and then deep strike everything else or something silly like that. You're going to give it First Blood most of the time if they want to. Now, they might not want to do it.
Or they might elect to weaken something else.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that a Rhino is going to cost you the game based on First Blood.
Right.
If you really think it's going to, put the Rhinos in reserve for all I care. Just have your Marines standing out there on foot. But with the way shooting is going, with the way Tau and Eldar are out there, they're going to kill something. They're going to drop what they want to first turn.
I was even thinking of the White Scars list I've been playing around with. And since I can't afford bikes, I play with paper cutouts to test this list. I was going, well, I have a bunch of 8-man bike squads. Maybe they could. Oh, right, but I took 3 stalkers. So I'm pretty sure my enemy can kill one AV-12 vehicle on the first turn if they really want to.
Yeah. So, I don't think it's as, end of the world as people thought it was at the beginning of 6th edition. In defense, I did see people with posts about still taking transports, using them to block line of sight for independent characters, sniping, things like that. But then, of course, they did post the same all biker lists or something like that. That you're like, well, you kind of contradicted yourself there. But
yeah, I think the all biker list. I guess it's not a topic for today, so I won't go into it. But I'll just throw out there that it's strong, but it's not top tier if that's all you're doing.
Yeah. One thing of note: there is nothing more annoying than having a Rhino running around on turn 3, even if it doesn't have anything inside.
Yeah.
But having a Rhino sit in places and block line of sight to the opponent's stuff.
It's just a big dumb hippo that gets in the way of everything.
Yeah, I mean, put it in front of a Thunderfire cannon and all of a sudden that Thunderfire cannon has to shoot indirectly all the time because the Tech Marine's like trying to peek up over it.
Yeah.
Things like that just make it annoying, and it's really fast. So you use them beyond turn 1 or 2.
Yeah, you can stop assaults before you too. I mean, very literally a wall in the way.
Yeah.
You just put them between units, and suddenly even very fast units can't get to you necessarily.
Yeah, multi-assaulting tanks is a difficult procedure now too. I mean, tanks and other units, things like that, since you have to fill up whatever you can in base to base.
Yeah, and also you suffer disordered charge.
Yeah,
So a lot of
yeah.
times
On
it
top
isn't
of
even
that,
worth it to charge anymore if you're trying to hold.
So cool. Well, anything else on dedicated transports or?
No, I think we finished this cast.
Oh, one last thing. I'm 99% certain of this, but a dedicated transport does take up the same unit role as the unit it's bought for. So, like, if I buy a Wave Serpent for Dark Reapers, it becomes a heavy support Wave Serpent.
Oh, in terms of scoring
In
for like
terms of
guns?
certain scoring things, so
Really?
you can always drop some extra stuff in there.
I'm gonna have to look that up. I don't know if I believe you.
You probably should. Actually, the entire internet should look that up because I think I'm making up stuff at this point. So with
Okay.
that, we think we can call it a day.
And we hope you enjoyed the cast. We'll try to do another one fairly soon.
Yeah, if there's anything you guys want to hear about, feel free to post it on there. So.
I've been Sir Biscuit.
And I'm John Bunn. Have a good night.